Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we dive into the story, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, some perhaps listening in the quiet of midnight, others in the early hours of dawn, and a few in the middle of their day, slipping into a gentle rest while a story unfolds. Now, let's begin with something you may not hear too often. When people think of the Middle Ages, their minds usually wander to castles in Europe, knights in shining armor, bustling markets in old cities, or perhaps dark forests with stories of witchcraft and superstition. But tonight, we are going to travel far away from that image, across the wide oceans, into a land that was just as full of life, just as complex, and in many ways even more surprising. We are going to speak about the Americas in the medieval era, long before the ships of explorers arrived, long before written records from Europe began to describe these lands. This was a world of its own, and for the people living there, their lives were as real, as rich, and as meaningful as those of peasants, nobles, and merchants across the Atlantic. Imagine for a moment waking up in a village in what is now Mexico, centuries before Columbus. The morning sun would rise over fields carefully tended by generations. Instead of wheat and barley, you would see maize growing tall and green, its stalks swaying gently in the breeze. Alongside maize were beans and squash, the famous three sisters of agriculture that sustained entire civilizations. The air carried a different scent than in Europe, smoky from fires used for cooking, earthy from the rich soil, and sometimes heavy with the fragrance of cacao being ground into paste. Life here was structured, ordered, and full of traditions, though very different from the manor houses and feudal obligations of medieval Europe. People lived in homes of wood, clay, and stone, built to suit their climate. In warmer regions, houses might be airy, with walls woven from reeds, while in colder highlands, structures of stone and plaster kept out the chill of the mountains. Villages and cities were carefully planned, with roads and plazas that showed an understanding of community and order. Just as peasants in France or England would gather in markets, here too, people came together, trading not only food and tools but also obsidian blades, bright feathers, and finely woven cloth. Imagine walking through one of those markets. The sounds of voices haggling, the smells of roasted maize, spicy chilies, and the sweet drink made from cacao. Children darting between stalls, dogs weaving through the crowds, and the hum of a world in motion. But medieval America was not a single story. It was thousands of stories at once. From the vast forests of the Amazon, where people shaped the land with hidden gardens and enriched soils, to the icy reaches of the far north, where Inuit hunters carved a living from the sea, life varied endlessly. Still, there were patterns that held them together. In almost every region, communities worked as collectives. The work of planting, building, hunting, and even storytelling was often shared. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of medieval Europe's feudal lords and serfs, in many places here, leadership was more fluid, sometimes tied to spiritual roles, sometimes to warriors, and often to the respect earned by providing for others. Religion and the spiritual world shaped daily existence just as much as the church bells did in Europe. Instead of grand cathedrals, imagine towering pyramids, sacred mounds, or open spaces where rituals tied earth, sky, and water together. Every grain of maize, every drop of rain, every shift of the stars was woven into belief. These were not abstract ideas but living truths, guiding when to plant, when to hunt, and how to celebrate. Life was hard, yes, with disease, hunger, and conflict always near, but it was also beautiful, with music made on flutes and drums, dances carried out under the open sky, and art carved into stone or painted in colors that still shine today. Think for a moment about what they ate. While peasants in Europe chewed on coarse bread and thin porridge, people here enjoyed foods that would one day become staples across the entire world. Maize was ground into tortillas, roasted into tamales, or boiled into stews. Beans provided protein, squash gave variety, and chilies spiced up nearly everything. In some places, they fished rivers that overflowed with life, catching not only fish but also turtles and birds. In others, they hunted deer, rabbits, or even bison. The wealthy or noble classes, in larger cities, might sip on a bitter, frothy chocolate drink flavored with spices, a delicacy unknown to Europe for centuries to come. Daily life was not always easy, but it had its joys. Children played with simple toys, spinning tops, or chasing one another through fields. Families gathered to tell stories, passing down history not in books but in memory and performance. Games like the famous ball game, where players used their hips to strike a rubber ball through stone rings, were more than entertainment. They were rituals tied to the balance of the universe. Imagine the energy of a crowd watching such a game, the sound of drums echoing, the ball bouncing, and the players straining with all their strength to keep it in motion. And while all of this feels far away, it is important to remember that this was happening at the very same time knights rode across Europe. Monks copied manuscripts in candlelight, and traders traveled the Silk Road. The world was never one-sided. The medieval age was not only castles and crusades. It was also these vibrant cities, villages, and traditions across the Atlantic, alive with color and meaning. Tonight, as we slowly explore this forgotten side of the Middle Ages, we will journey deeper into what life truly felt like for those who lived it, step by step, food by food, song by song, and story by story. If you close your eyes and imagine yourself walking through one of those ancient cities of the Americas, the first thing that might strike you is the sheer scale of it all. Far from being scattered villages lost in forests, there were vast urban centers, rivaling and sometimes surpassing the population of European cities of the same era. Take, for example, the grand city of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a lake. Imagine canals glistening with water, causeways stretching out like bridges of stone, and markets bustling with tens of thousands of people each day. Imagine the noise of traders calling out their goods, the laughter of children running barefoot across the plazas, and the hum of conversation in a language unfamiliar yet rhythmic, carrying with it centuries of tradition. Houses here were often neatly arranged, sometimes in clusters that showed careful thought in how a community should live. Families would wake together, the first task often tending the hearth and preparing food. Women might grind maize on stone slabs, the repetitive sound of grinding becoming a part of the household rhythm, while men headed to the fields or workshops. Children had their roles too, learning from their parents not only how to work but also how to respect the spirits, the ancestors, and the natural world. Unlike in medieval Europe, where written documents shaped inheritance and rights, here the past was remembered through oral tradition. Stories, songs, and performances ensured that the memory of ancestors lived on, and forgetting was almost unthinkable. The role of community was immense. You did not live only for yourself but as part of something larger, something tied together by fields, rituals, and common responsibilities. The planting of maize was not a solitary act, it was a collective one. Imagine dozens of hands working together, digging, planting, and singing as they went. At harvest time, entire communities celebrated, giving thanks not only to one another but also to the earth and sky. Feasts followed, with food shared generously, music played deep into the night, and dances performed in great circles, their rhythm echoing into the dark. Music itself was everywhere. Flutes carved from bone or clay, drums stretched with animal hides, and rattles filled with seeds or stones provided the soundtrack to daily life. In villages and cities alike, sound marked time. Just as in Europe the ringing of church bells told peasants when to work or pray, here the beat of the drum could signal ceremonies, games, or important gatherings. Songs were not simply for entertainment. They carried meaning, teaching history, guiding rituals, and sometimes even serving as prayers for rain or good harvests. But life was not only work and worship. Leisure had its place too. Children might chase butterflies in the fields or play games with stones and sticks. Teenagers competed in athletic contests, sometimes with extraordinary skill, showing endurance that amazed even those who had seen it countless times before. And then, of course, there was the great ball game. Imagine a wide stone court, with tall walls and heavy rings set high above the ground. Players moved quickly, striking the ball with hips, elbows, and knees, never allowed to use their hands. The game carried a weight beyond sport. It was tied to myths of life and death, of the sun and the underworld, of order and chaos. When the ball struck the stone with a loud thud, it was more than a game. It was a reminder of the balance that held the universe together. As you walk through these imagined streets, you might also notice something striking about trade and wealth. Without horses, carts, or large draft animals, goods moved by human effort. Traders carried bundles on their backs or used canoes along rivers and lakes. Yet despite these challenges, trade flourished. Bright feathers from tropical birds, cacao beans from the south, obsidian from volcanic lands, and salt from the coasts all made their way across vast distances. A single marketplace could offer goods from hundreds of miles away, showing a level of connection that few people today realize existed. Daily meals reflected this abundance. While the poor often lived on simple combinations of maize and beans, flavored with chilies or herbs, those with more wealth might enjoy turkey meat, freshwater fish, or even exotic fruits. In some regions, people kept dogs not only as companions but also as a source of food, a practice strange to modern minds yet part of survival at the time. Drinks made from cacao, sometimes spiced with chili or honey, were valued highly, served during rituals or given to leaders as a mark of respect. To sit and drink chocolate was not just refreshment, it was a sign of status, much like wine at a European noble's table. And yet, survival was never guaranteed. Just as in Europe, disease could sweep through, hunger could strike if harvests failed, and enemies could attack without warning. Villages built palisades of wood or stone walls to guard against raiders. Warriors trained from a young age, their skill with obsidian blades or spears honed in practice and in real battle. Warfare was not simply destruction. It was tied to honor, to capturing enemies, and to rituals that reinforced the community's connection to the gods. The sight of warriors marching, painted in bright colors, feathers adorning their heads, and drums pounding in unison, must have filled both pride and fear in equal measure. Still, ordinary life continued. At night, families gathered around fires, telling stories of the past. The stars stretched endlessly above them, and with no artificial lights to dim the heavens, the Milky Way shone bright and clear. To them, these stars were not just distant points of light but guides, gods, and reminders of where they came from. Children listened to elders describe how the world was created, how the sun and moon once battled, how great ancestors walked before them. Each story reinforced identity, weaving individuals into something larger. This was medieval America. Not silent, not primitive, but alive, with voices, music, and meaning. And as we continue deeper into this story, we will discover more about how they lived, what they cherished, and how their lives, though different from those in Europe, carried the same weight of human experience. As we drift further into the daily rhythm of medieval America, it becomes clear that life was a delicate balance between the practical needs of survival and the deep spiritual frameworks that gave meaning to every action. Unlike the Europe of castles and kingdoms, where feudal obligations tied peasants to their lords, here the ties were often spiritual and communal, built on shared work and shared belief. To rise with the sun meant not only to begin a day of labor but to honor the cycle of life, to recognize that human existence was tied directly to the rising and setting of celestial bodies. In many regions, the act of planting a seed was not simply agricultural, it was sacred. A farmer bent over the soil would whisper prayers, asking the earth to accept the offering of maize kernels, calling upon the spirits of rain and fertility. Every stalk of maize that grew was not just food but proof of a covenant between people and the world around them. If a harvest was plentiful, it was a blessing. If it failed, it was not merely misfortune but a sign that something had gone wrong in the balance between humans and the divine. Entire ceremonies revolved around restoring this harmony. Consider for a moment how houses were arranged. In some cultures, homes encircled plazas, open squares that became the heart of community life. Here, decisions were made, disputes settled, rituals performed, and games played. Children grew up running barefoot across these plazas, learning their first steps of dance or listening to the laughter of neighbors. The architecture itself reflected values: communal spaces at the center, personal dwellings at the edges. The individual lived within the collective, never apart from it. Art played a role that went far beyond decoration. Walls and ceramics bore images of gods, animals, and patterns that told stories. A pot was not merely a vessel for carrying water. It was a canvas carrying the memory of ancestors. Bright pigments made from minerals and plants colored murals that survived for centuries, testifying to the human desire to leave a mark, to ensure that the beauty of life was not lost to time. When you picture a medieval hall in Europe adorned with tapestries, imagine its counterpart in the Americas. Walls alive with color, patterns dancing in the firelight, every detail alive with meaning. Jewelry too spoke of more than wealth. Shells gathered from distant coasts, jade mined from deep mountains, and obsidian shards polished until they gleamed all became symbols of identity. To wear a necklace of jade beads was not only to display beauty, but to declare one's connection to the earth, to the life-giving forces that the stone symbolized. Even the simplest adornments carried weight, for they tied the wearer to myths and stories that had been told for generations. Education, in many ways, was embedded into daily life. There were no formal schools for most children, yet every day was a lesson. A boy learned to fish by watching his father cast nets in the river. A girl learned to grind maize by listening to the rhythm of her mother's hands on the stone. Elders told stories not as idle entertainment but as instruction, reminding children of the values of courage, generosity, and respect for the sacred. In larger cities, more formal systems existed. Scribes and priests trained carefully in calendars, rituals, and astronomy. The tracking of time was precise, with calendars rivaling and sometimes surpassing those of Europe. They could predict eclipses, track the turning of seasons, and align temples with the movements of stars. To them, time was not simply a line but a great cycle, repeating endlessly, shaping the rhythm of both human and divine life. Nighttime in these communities was different from what we know today. Without the hum of machines or the glow of artificial light, nights were filled with silence broken only by the sounds of nature, the chirp of crickets, the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Fires flickered in courtyards, smoke curling upward into the dark. Families huddled close, telling stories or simply resting, their lives lit by firelight and starlight. The stars above were not distant, cold points of light but living presences, gods and ancestors, always watching. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, and to many it represented a river, a pathway for souls, a reminder of journeys both earthly and eternal. Yet, for all its beauty, life was often fragile. Droughts could wither crops, forcing families to travel long distances in search of food. Floods could destroy homes in a single night, reminding everyone that nature held ultimate power. Warfare, too, was an ever-present danger. Some conflicts were small, raids for food or captives, while others escalated into struggles between entire city-states. Warriors painted in vivid colors, wearing feathers that shone in the sun, marched into battle with obsidian-tipped spears and shields decorated with symbols of their gods. To fight was not merely political. It was spiritual, reinforcing myths of creation, sacrifice, and the endless struggle between life and death. Still, in the quiet between wars and harvests, life carried on with an almost timeless rhythm. A mother taught her child to weave, guiding small hands through the careful motion of thread over thread. A fisherman pushed his canoe into a lake at dawn, the mist rising as he cast his net. A priest studied the stars from a temple platform, his eyes tracing the slow journey of planets across the sky. Each moment was ordinary, yet each was also sacred, bound to a worldview that saw no division between the practical and the divine. And so, when we think of medieval America, we must set aside the image of emptiness or simplicity. These were societies as full of meaning, as complex in their ways of life, and as deeply human as any across the oceans. Their lives, though shaped by different crops, tools, and gods, carried the same weight of joy and fear, of laughter and loss, of survival and hope. To understand them is not only to learn history but to glimpse a reflection of our own humanity, stretched across time, across oceans, and across the endless night sky. As we go further into the fabric of medieval American life, one of the most striking elements we find is the role of ritual. Ritual was not reserved for rare occasions. It was a constant rhythm, woven into planting, harvesting, marriage, warfare, and even death. Imagine waking at dawn to see neighbors preparing for a small ceremony to ask for rain. A priest, dressed in intricate garments decorated with feathers and shells, might sprinkle water across the earth, chant prayers to the spirits of the sky, and offer smoke from burning incense that curled upward into the air. For the people, this was not symbolic. It was a real dialogue with forces beyond themselves, a way of ensuring survival in a world that could be both generous and harsh. Temples and ceremonial platforms dominated many cityscapes. They rose above the homes and markets, not unlike how church towers or cathedrals rose above European towns. From these high places, rituals guided the life of entire communities. The calendar told when ceremonies should be held, and these events gathered everyone: farmers, merchants, warriors, children, and elders. Drums echoed across plazas, conch shells blew, and dancers painted in vivid colors moved in circles, their steps meant to mirror the movements of stars and the cycles of time. To stand in the middle of such a gathering must have been overwhelming, the air thick with sound, smell, and devotion, a living testament to the belief that humanity was part of a cosmic order. But life was not only about worship, it was also about ingenuity. The people of medieval America developed sophisticated methods to master their environments. Along the coasts, fishermen built traps and used nets with skill, ensuring steady catches even in difficult seasons. In the highlands, farmers carved terraces into mountainsides, transforming steep slopes into fertile farmland. In the wetlands, they constructed chinampas, floating gardens that produced remarkable harvests. Imagine rows of crops growing on man-made islands, canals weaving between them, and canoes gliding silently through the water. These gardens could feed thousands, sustaining great cities year after year. Trade tied distant lands together, and with trade came cultural exchange. The obsidian of one region traveled hundreds of miles to become a blade in another. Feathers from tropical birds adorned headdresses far from their natural homes. Salt, cacao, shells, and stones moved along vast networks, carried by traders whose journeys were long and often dangerous. To walk through a bustling marketplace was to see the entire world of medieval America in miniature. A collection of colors, textures, and scents that spoke of lands far away. Just as merchants along the Silk Road connected Asia and Europe, traders here created webs of connection across jungles, deserts, mountains, and coasts. For entertainment, beyond music and games, there were festivals filled with laughter, dance, and storytelling. Storytellers were not idle entertainers. They were guardians of memory. With no books to pass down written histories in most regions, it was through performance that the past lived on. Elders gathered audiences of children and adults alike, their voices rising and falling as they recounted epic tales of gods, ancestors, and legendary heroes. Some stories explained the origins of maize, others spoke of great floods or battles between celestial beings. Listeners sat quietly, drawn into a world where myth and reality blended, and through these stories, they learned values that guided everyday life. The structure of families and social groups also revealed a depth often overlooked. Families were not isolated units but part of broader clans and lineages. Marriage connected not only two individuals but entire groups, weaving a stronger web of alliances and responsibilities. Children were seen as blessings not only for their parents but for the community, carrying forward traditions and ensuring continuity. The elderly, in turn, held honored places, for they carried the wisdom of decades and served as living links to the ancestors. Unlike in Europe, where literacy often placed priests or nobles above others, here memory and oral skill could elevate someone to respect and prominence. Health and medicine reflected both practical knowledge and spiritual belief. Healers used plants with remarkable skill, herbs that reduced pain, roots that treated fever, leaves that eased digestion. Knowledge of the body was passed down carefully, tied always to rituals that acknowledged the spirits. A healer might not only prepare a remedy but also perform a chant or offer incense, addressing both the physical and the spiritual side of illness. While Europe's medieval doctors often relied on humors and astrology, healers here saw illness as a disruption of harmony, requiring balance to be restored. Death, too, carried its rituals and beliefs. Burials varied, but they always emphasized connection to the community and the ancestors. Some were laid to rest with offerings of food, tools, or ornaments, items thought to aid them in the journey beyond. To the living, the dead were not gone but present, still watching, still guiding. Certain days of the year were dedicated to honoring them, with offerings placed at altars, songs sung in remembrance, and food shared among families. These traditions echoed across centuries, some surviving even into modern times. And while the cycles of birth, life, and death defined human experience, there was always the larger environment to contend with. The forests provided wood and animals, but they also concealed dangers. Rivers fed communities but could flood without warning. Mountains gave resources but demanded respect. Every part of the landscape was seen as alive, as inhabited by spirits that required acknowledgement. This view created a constant sense of connection. A hunter entering a forest might whisper apologies to the deer he sought. A farmer might thank the earth before harvesting. A traveler might leave an offering at a crossroads. These small acts built a daily relationship between people and the vast, mysterious world around them. To step back and see this entire picture is to realize that medieval America was not an empty stage waiting for European discovery. It was a living, breathing theater of human experience. Cities that rivaled any in the old world, farms that fed thousands, rituals that carried meaning, and people who loved, feared, celebrated, and mourned in ways at once unique and deeply familiar. Their lives were not lesser versions of Europe's, but parallel stories, unfolding under the same sun, the same stars, and the same timeless human need to make sense of the world. As our journey through medieval America continues, the picture becomes even more vivid when we focus on the rhythms of daily work and the skills people developed to sustain their communities. Work was not just about survival, it was a craft, often performed with care, patience, and pride. Farmers, for instance, understood the soil in ways passed down through generations. They knew when to burn fields to clear them, when to rotate crops, and how to enrich the ground with organic matter. Their methods, though lacking the tools of Europe's plows or iron, were nonetheless effective, ensuring steady harvests year after year. Each seed placed in the ground was part of a chain that stretched back to ancestors and forward to children not yet born. As our journey through medieval America continues, the picture becomes even more vivid when we focus on the rhythms of daily work and the skills people developed to sustain their communities. Work was not just about survival, it was a craft, often performed with care, patience, and pride. Farmers, for instance, understood the soil in ways passed down through generations. They knew when to burn fields to clear them, when to rotate crops, and how to enrich the ground with organic matter. Their methods, though lacking the tools of Europe's plows or iron, were nonetheless effective, ensuring steady harvests year after year. Each seed placed in the ground was part of a chain that stretched back to ancestors and forward to children not yet born. Craftsmanship extended into every corner of life. Potters shaped clay into vessels not only for storing food and water but also for ceremonial use. Imagine holding a clay bowl painted with patterns of serpents or birds, the designs telling stories that might stretch back centuries. Each line drawn by the potter's hand carried cultural memory. Weavers created textiles of extraordinary complexity, dyed with natural pigments that produced shades of deep red, rich blue, and bright yellow. To wear such a garment was more than fashion. It was identity, a statement of belonging to a place, a people, and a history. Stoneworkers carved temples and monuments with astonishing skill. Without iron tools, they relied on obsidian and harder stones, yet they managed to shape blocks so precise that some structures still stand centuries later. The labor behind these achievements was immense. Men and women carried stones for long distances, organized in communal efforts that demanded cooperation. Building was never just technical, it was spiritual. To raise a temple was to recreate the cosmos in miniature, to give the community a center that connected earth, sky, and the underworld. Each step, each wall, Each carving was infused with symbolic meaning. The natural world provided both inspiration and challenge. Forests offered wood for construction, resin for incense, and animals for food and clothing. Rivers and lakes gave water, fish, and routes for travel. Yet, these same forces could be dangerous. A sudden storm might sweep away crops, a flood could devastate an entire village, and a drought might linger for years. Communities responded not only with practical measures but also with ritual ones, offering thanks when resources were plentiful and pleading with spirits when disaster struck. This blend of practicality and spirituality created a worldview where no action was without meaning. One cannot overlook the role of astronomy in shaping these societies. Priests and astronomers observed the heavens with remarkable precision. They tracked the path of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the movements of planets. Temples and pyramids were aligned with celestial events, so that on solstices or equinoxes, the rising sun would cast perfect shadows or light up certain carvings. To them, the sky was a great book, its patterns telling stories about creation, destiny, and the cycles of time. Festivals often coincided with these alignments, reinforcing the connection between human life and the cosmos. Food remained at the center of existence, not only as sustenance but as culture. Maize, beans, and squash formed the foundation, yet countless variations existed. Maize could be ground into flour for tortillas, roasted as kernels, boiled into soups, or wrapped in leaves to form tamales. Beans came in many varieties, each adding flavor and nutrition. Squash, with its edible flesh and seeds, provided variety and richness. Chilies spiced dishes, while herbs added subtle flavors. In coastal regions, fish and shellfish expanded the diet, while inland, people relied more on turkey, deer, or small game. The act of sharing food at festivals or family gatherings carried deep symbolic weight, binding communities together. Clothing, too, reflected not just necessity but meaning. Cotton, grown and spun with care, provided material for the wealthy, while simpler fibers clothed farmers and laborers. Designs were often bold, with geometric shapes and animal motifs. A cloak of fine cotton marked high status, while feathers of exotic birds adorned the headdresses of nobles and warriors. Feathers were especially valued, not only for their beauty but for their symbolic power. To wear the bright feathers of a quetzal, for example, was to carry a fragment of the divine, a living piece of the sky itself. Children grew within this intricate web of culture, guided from their earliest days to take on roles in the community. Games were not only play but preparation. A child running with friends through the fields learned stamina and coordination. A girl weaving small threads learned patience and skill. A boy practicing with a wooden spear learned discipline and responsibility. These lessons were gradual, often unnoticed by the children themselves, but essential in shaping capable adults. Elders oversaw this process with patience, their presence a reminder that knowledge and wisdom did not vanish with age but deepened. Night brought a different rhythm. After the day's work, fires glowed across villages and cities. Families gathered, eating, laughing, and talking as the stars wheeled above. Some nights were filled with music, others with quiet reflection. The sound of drums might echo from a distant plaza, signaling a festival, while in smaller homes, the simple crackle of fire created a backdrop for stories. These stories ranged from humorous tales of tricksters to solemn myths of creation. Children listened with wide eyes, adults nodded in recognition, and the elderly added their voices, ensuring the past was never forgotten. Through it all, a sense of connection to something larger permeated daily life. Whether through the planting of crops, the carving of stone, the weaving of cloth, or the telling of stories, people lived with an awareness that they were part of cycles far beyond themselves. They were tied to the land, to the sky, to their ancestors, and to generations yet to come. In larger cities, leadership grew even more elaborate. Nobles oversaw districts, priests managed temples and rituals, and military leaders protected borders and ensured the flow of tribute. Tribute itself was a fundamental aspect of life. Smaller villages often sent food, textiles, or crafted goods to larger centers, and in return they received protection, trade opportunities, and participation in great ceremonies. This flow created bonds across vast regions, much like feudal obligations tied peasants to lords in Europe. Yet here, obligation was not always enforced with iron or sword. It was reinforced with belief, the understanding that supporting the great city meant ensuring cosmic order. The role of warriors cannot be overlooked. In many societies, warriors held respected status, not only as protectors but as vital participants in ritual and myth. To be a warrior was not only about physical strength. It demanded discipline, courage, and often a deep understanding of sacred traditions. Victories in battle were celebrated not only for territorial gains but for their spiritual importance. The capture of enemies sometimes carried religious meaning, for the act of warfare was tied to cosmic balance. Though this aspect can appear harsh to us today, for them it was part of a worldview where life and death were inseparable from the cycles of the sun, rain, and harvest. Markets, meanwhile, acted as beating hearts of daily life, connecting people from all walks of society. Merchants brought cacao, salt, obsidian, pottery, textiles, feathers, and countless other goods to plazas where bargaining and exchange filled the air with energy. Unlike the clamor of modern markets filled with coins and notes, trade here often relied on barter, though some goods, like cacao beans or cotton cloth, became widely accepted as a kind of currency. Imagine walking through such a market. The smell of roasted maize, the bright shimmer of turquoise jewelry, the chatter of dozens of voices, each speaking in a slightly different dialect. It was more than commerce. It was social life, a place where news spread, friendships were formed, and alliances forged. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined, and temples stood not only as places of worship, but also as centers of administration. Priests kept records, not on paper but through knotted cords, painted codices, or memory carefully trained from youth. They tracked the calendar, ensuring that rituals matched the movement of the stars. They advised rulers, interpreting omens and dreams, guiding decisions that could affect thousands. Their power was immense, but so too was their responsibility. If a drought came, if crops failed, if sickness spread, people turned to priests for answers. The role was not without risk, for failure could mean loss of trust and, in some cases, loss of life. Even among ordinary people, spirituality was never distant. Every household kept small altars, adorned with simple offerings of food, flowers, or incense. Parents taught children how to speak to the spirits, how to give thanks before meals, how to ask for guidance before journeys. Festivals were community-wide, but faith was lived in daily acts, in whispers to the earth while planting seeds, in songs sung at dawn to greet the rising sun, in prayers murmured to ancestors before sleep. This blending of the sacred and the everyday created a seamless existence where the divine was not separate from the human. It was always present, in every action. Education took many forms depending on the region. In small villages, children learned from their parents. Farmers taught their sons to plant and their daughters to weave. Hunters trained the next generation in tracking and stealth, and healers passed on knowledge of plants to apprentices. In great cities, however, specialized schools existed. Sons of nobles studied history, astronomy, rhetoric, and warfare, while daughters of noble families learned music, dance, and the skills of household management. Commoners' children were not excluded. Though their training was often more practical, they too absorbed the values and traditions that bound society together. Stories, songs, and proverbs acted as textbooks, each lesson carefully shaped to preserve memory and identity. Festivals provided release from the daily rhythm of work. Some lasted only a day, others stretched across weeks, filled with feasting, dancing, and ritual. During these times, life turned upside down. Hierarchies blurred, laughter filled the air, and the ordinary gave way to the extraordinary. Dancers painted their bodies in bright colors, musicians played drums and flutes late into the night, and storytellers performed before crowds. Food was shared freely, drinks passed around, and people celebrated not just their gods, but their own resilience and unity. To be part of such a festival was to feel the pulse of community, to remember that life, even with its hardships, was a gift to be savored. Travel connected all of these elements together. Messengers ran across long distances, carrying news and tribute. Traders walked for weeks through forests, deserts, and mountains, leading caravans of llamas in the Andes or carrying goods on their backs in Mesoamerica. Roads, sometimes paved with stone, sometimes simple paths through wilderness, linked communities across vast distances. Bridges spanned rivers, rafts crossed lakes, and canoes glided through canals. This movement of people ensured that no village was ever truly isolated. Through travel, ideas spread, new farming techniques, religious concepts, styles of clothing, even stories and songs. The continent was a vast tapestry, and the threads of travel wove it together into something greater than its parts. Looking at this, we see that medieval America was not static. It was dynamic, constantly moving, changing, and adapting. It was a world of innovation, of resilience, of creativity expressed in stone, song, and seed. And though we often imagine it as distant, frozen in the past, when we step closer, we can feel the humanity that flows through it, the same heartbeat that echoes in us today. If we step further into the world of medieval America, what emerges most vividly is how people shaped their surroundings into landscapes of meaning. Nature was not a backdrop. It was alive, infused with stories, spirits, and lessons. Mountains were not just stone but sacred beings. Rivers carried not only water but memory. Forests whispered with both danger and wisdom. To live in such an environment meant constantly negotiating between the practical need to survive and the deeper obligation to honor what sustained life. Agriculture, which we already touched upon, carried layers of ritual. Before planting maize, farmers often performed ceremonies to ask for fertile soil and steady rains. Families might bury offerings in the fields, shells, beads, or small clay figures, to ensure the earth remained generous. Harvest was never only a matter of gathering food. It was a celebration of cosmic balance. Songs accompanied the cutting of maize stalks, dances honored the spirits of the fields, and the community feasted to give thanks. To outsiders, this might look like superstition, but for those who lived it, these acts were part of an unbroken cycle. Plant, grow, harvest, give back. Without the ritual, life itself felt incomplete. Hunting carried similar significance. A hunter tracking deer through forest shadows did not see the animal only as meat. He saw it as a gift, a being whose life was given so that his community might live. Hunters often whispered apologies or thanks after a kill, sometimes leaving small offerings to honor the spirit of the animal. This respect was not symbolic. It was a recognition of interdependence. To hunt carelessly, to waste, or to kill without acknowledgement risked angering forces far greater than oneself. These beliefs shaped behavior, ensuring balance between need and responsibility. Music and dance flourished everywhere, not as luxuries but as necessities. Drums made from stretched animal hide, flutes carved from bone or wood, rattles filled with seeds, all combined to create rhythms that echoed through plazas and valleys. Music marked time, structured ceremonies, and accompanied nearly every important event. Children grew up hearing lullabies that carried ancestral wisdom. Young men and women danced together during festivals, steps rehearsed not for entertainment alone but as living prayers. Even work had rhythm. Farmers sang as they planted, rowers chanted to keep time, builders hummed as they lifted stones. Life moved to the cadence of sound. Artistry extended into every surface of daily existence. Walls of temples were painted with murals depicting gods, warriors, and animals. Textiles carried patterns representing stars, rivers, and mountains. Pottery displayed spirals and lines that told of movement, growth, and time. These designs were not decoration alone. They were language, a form of writing that spoke of identity and belief. To wear a tunic with certain patterns was to declare allegiance to a lineage. To drink from a cup with painted serpents was to participate in myth. Even the simplest tools carried aesthetic care, handles carved with animals, blades etched with symbols. Beauty was inseparable from function. Medicine revealed another dimension of knowledge. Healers knew hundreds of plants, each with its own properties. Bark could reduce fever, roots could soothe pain, Leaves could cleanse wounds. But healing was never purely physical, it was also spiritual. A healer might treat illness with herbs, and at the same time perform chants or rituals to drive away harmful forces. Illness, after all, was often seen as imbalance between body and spirit, person and community, human and cosmos. Recovery required not only remedies but reconciliation, restoring harmony where it had been broken. Family life anchored all of this. A household often included not just parents and children but grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins, each contributing to daily work. Meals were communal, tasks shared, responsibilities distributed according to age and skill. Children cared for younger siblings, teenagers helped in fields or workshops, elders told stories while weaving mats or grinding maize. Bonds extended outward, linking families into neighborhoods, neighborhoods into villages, villages into entire networks of kinship. Kinship was both protection and identity. It told you who you were, where you belonged, and whom you could trust. Seasonal cycles structured everything. Planting, harvesting, hunting, fishing, all depended on timing. Calendars were essential, tracking not only days but sacred rhythms. Some societies kept 2 calendars, one solar and one ritual, their interlocking cycles creating moments of great significance when both aligned. On such days, ceremonies intensified, sacrifices were offered, and people gathered in greater numbers. Time was not just counted, it was lived, a sacred pattern woven into every act. Stories gave shape to this pattern, teaching values and preserving history. Myths explained why the sun rose, why maize grew, why death was necessary for life to continue. Legends told of heroes who crossed rivers of fire, of tricksters who outwitted gods, of ancestors who transformed into stars. These stories were not simply entertainment. They were lessons in disguise. A tale about a lazy man punished by spirits reminded children of the value of work. A myth about a woman who became the moon explained not only the night sky but the importance of balance between male and female forces. Through stories, people learned how to live. Nighttime, once again, returned everything to quiet reflection. After the noise of the market or the intensity of ritual, families sat by their fires, watching sparks rise into the dark. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a celestial road, connecting villages below to realms above. People gazed upward not in silence alone but in conversation, pointing out constellations shaped like animals, heroes, or gods. For them, the stars were not distant. They were neighbors, companions, eternal reminders that life on Earth was part of something vast and enduring. And so, every detail of medieval American life, whether planting maize, weaving cloth, hunting deer, dancing at festivals, or gazing at stars, was saturated with meaning. Nothing was accidental, nothing merely practical. To live was to participate in a grand cycle, to accept responsibility not only for oneself but for the land, the ancestors, and the gods. This worldview gave resilience in the face of hardship, joy in the midst of work, and purpose in the ordinary. As medieval America unfolded in all its variety, one cannot ignore how landscapes themselves shaped the destiny of communities. Vast mountains, dense forests, endless plains, and winding rivers each demanded adaptation, and people responded with creativity that turned challenges into opportunities. Where the high Andes pressed into the sky, people carved terraces into steep slopes, transforming inhospitable rock into fertile farmland. In the jungles, others wove paths through tangled trees and harnessed rivers as natural highways. On the plains, mobility became essential, with communities spreading out across wide horizons where sky and earth seemed to merge. The environment was not a silent stage. It was the ever-present partner in survival. Take water, for instance. Entire societies rose and fell based on how they managed this single resource. In dry valleys, canals and irrigation networks spread like veins through the soil, guiding precious streams to crops. These systems demanded coordination, for no single family could dig or maintain canals alone. Instead, communities gathered season after season, tools in hand, repairing walls of earth, clearing weeds, redirecting flow. In this way, irrigation was not only technology, it was social glue, binding people together in shared responsibility. Without cooperation, fields dried, and hunger followed. With unity, abundance flourished. Fishing communities developed equally ingenious methods. Along coasts, fish were caught with nets woven from plant fibers, while inland rivers provided not only fish but turtles, crustaceans, and waterfowl. In some regions, people built traps of stone, creating enclosures where fish swam at high tide and remained stranded when waters receded. These clever constructions required careful knowledge of tides and currents, a science passed down through generations of observation. When fish were plentiful, they were smoked or salted for storage, ensuring food security for leaner months. Food preservation itself was a hallmark of resilience. In cold mountain regions, potatoes were freeze-dried into chuno, a lightweight food that could last for years. In warmer climates, maize was dried and stored in sealed containers to prevent rot. Salt, harvested from coastal flats or inland springs, became a vital preservative, and it doubled as a commodity for trade. To store food was not only to prepare for tomorrow but to safeguard against famine. For everyone knew that abundance could vanish in a season of drought or storm. Yet survival was never enough. Life demanded meaning. This is where ritual tied intimately with labor. When canals were cleaned, ceremonies often accompanied the work, offerings tossed into the flowing water to thank it for its gift. When fishing traps were first used in a season, small rituals marked the beginning, reminding people that they relied not solely on their hands but on the goodwill of the forces guiding nature. Work, in this sense, was never merely work. It was participation in a cosmic conversation, a reminder that humans were caretakers, not masters of the world around them. Travel between landscapes further enriched this complexity. Messengers could cross from snowy mountain passes into lush valleys within a matter of days, carrying not just goods but ideas. One community might teach another how to cultivate a new crop. In return, they might receive new weaving techniques or stories that explained unfamiliar stars. This constant exchange ensured that even the most distant villages were connected through invisible threads of trade and kinship. Social gatherings reflected these ties. Weddings, for example, were not small family affairs but events of great importance, often involving entire villages. A marriage was not simply the union of two individuals, it was the binding of two families, sometimes even two communities. Feasts stretched long into the night, with dances, music, and speeches celebrating the new bond. Gifts were exchanged. Textiles, pottery, animals, or food. Elders gave advice to the newlyweds, reminding them that their union carried responsibilities to kin and community. Through such events, society renewed itself, ensuring continuity across generations. Childhood, too, carried significance beyond simple growth. From early years, children learned not only practical skills but social values. They accompanied parents to fields, listening as adults explained which soil best suited maize or which signs in the sky predicted rain. They helped with weaving or pottery, their small hands imitating older ones until the motions became second nature. They absorbed stories at night, voices of grandparents weaving lessons into tales. Discipline was gentle yet firm, reminding them that laziness or selfishness harmed not only themselves but everyone. To raise a child was to raise a future bearer of tradition, and every step of learning ensured the chain of memory remained unbroken. The passing of elders was marked with equal care. Death was not seen as an end but as a transition, a journey to another realm where ancestors resided. Burials often included offerings, food for the journey, tools for use in the next world, ornaments to display status among spirits. Families visited graves, speaking to ancestors as though they still listened, asking for guidance or protection. This connection meant the dead were never gone. They lingered in the breath of wind, in the glow of fire, in the rhythm of stories retold. To forget them would be unthinkable, for they were anchors of identity. Even conflict carried structure. When disputes arose, whether over land, water, or honor, elders stepped in first, seeking peaceful resolution. If that failed, contests or small-scale combat sometimes settled matters, but even these were bound by rules, ensuring that violence did not spiral beyond control. Larger wars between city-states or confederations were far more destructive. Yet even then, warfare was framed within cultural meaning, often tied to religious obligations or cycles of power. To fight was to risk everything, but it was also to reaffirm the strength and resilience of one's people. Amid all of this complexity, joy persisted. Laughter echoed in markets, children chased one another through plazas, couples whispered in the shadows during festivals, friends gathered to drink chocolate or corned beer after long days of labor. Life was not only duty, ritual, or hardship. It was also celebration of small moments, of shared humanity. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of medieval America. Despite the distances, the differences, the unfamiliar customs, the heartbeat of joy and struggle was the same as ours today. If we step even further into the daily life of medieval America, one of the most fascinating aspects is how people balanced practicality and artistry, survival and beauty, labor and celebration. Life was demanding, yes, but it was also rich, textured, and intentional. Consider the way homes were constructed. Houses were not simply shelters. They were carefully designed to suit the environment, reflect social status, and integrate spiritual beliefs. In highland regions, dwellings might be built from stone, with roofs layered to shed rain and snow. In lowland villages, homes of wattle and daub provided ventilation in tropical heat, with thatched roofs keeping interiors cool. Doorways, walls, and hearths often carried symbolic markings, a subtle acknowledgement that domestic space was a microcosm of the larger world. Cooking and food preparation reveal a tapestry of ingenuity and taste. While maize, beans, and squash were staple ingredients, preparation methods were extraordinarily diverse. Maize could be nixtamalized, a chemical process that made the nutrients more accessible. Beans were boiled, mashed, or ground into pastes. Squash might be roasted, boiled, or dried. Families used mortars and pestles to grind grains, leaving rhythmic marks on walls and floors from repeated motion. Fire was central to life, with cooking not merely functional but a focal point for communal gathering. The scent of roasting meat, simmering stews, or fresh bread carried far across villages, signaling meals, festivals, or communal work. Water management remained critical and fascinating. In cities, canals channeled water from distant sources into fields and marketplaces, supporting both agriculture and daily life. Reservoirs captured rain, ensuring supply through dry seasons. Ingenious aqueducts and channels sometimes included sediment traps and filters, evidence of careful observation and experimentation. People understood not only where water flowed but when it was best used, showing a practical intelligence that modern engineers would admire. Clothing and textiles reflected both function and status. Cotton, maize fibers, and animal skins formed the basis of daily garments, but embellishments elevated them into art. Feathers, beads, and shells were woven into tunics and headdresses, each choice of decoration carrying meaning. A dancer's outfit for a festival could signal lineage, skill, or religious devotion. A warrior's cloak might tell of victories or acts of courage. Clothing was language without words, instantly communicating identity, allegiance, and values. Entertainment intertwined with education. Games taught agility, strategy, and endurance. Children played with small dolls or figures, imitating adults, enacting hunts, or reenacting ceremonies. Board games and puzzles existed in some regions, promoting critical thinking. Music and dance, as before, were not merely leisure. They reinforced social cohesion, celebrated achievements, and invoked spiritual protection. Every beat of a drum, every step of a dancer, every chant from the lips of a storyteller carried layers of purpose. Travel and trade connected disparate communities, creating networks that stretched hundreds of miles. Llamas in the Andes carried loads of goods, while canoes traversed rivers and lakes, linking villages and cities. Obsidian blades, jade ornaments, colorful textiles, and ceremonial items moved along these networks, not merely as commodities, but as carriers of culture. A piece of jade might begin in one city, be traded through 5 others, and finally arrive as part of a ritual, each transfer embedding it with new stories and meaning. Education was practical and cultural, often overlapping. Apprentices learned trades through hands-on experience. Weavers worked under skilled artisans, hunters observed elders tracking game, and young healers collected herbs under supervision. At the same time, oral instruction in history, ritual, and law reinforced collective memory. Children absorbed lessons embedded in narrative, learning not only how to act but why certain actions mattered. Oral tradition ensured that wisdom survived even without written records, preserving both continuity and innovation. Social cohesion depended on complex relationships. Families were extended networks. Kinship defined obligations, inheritance, and support. Marriage united not only individuals but communities. Alliances were cemented through shared labor, festivals, and ceremonies. Elder guidance maintained balance, ensuring that disputes over land, resources, or honor were resolved with minimal disruption. The community functioned as an organism, where each role, however small, contributed to collective survival and identity. Health and medicine reveal a sophisticated understanding of human biology and ecology. Healers knew dozens of medicinal plants, and treatments often combined multiple herbs for synergy. Ritual accompanied therapy, with incense, chants, and offerings addressing spiritual causes of illness. This dual approach, physical and spiritual, allowed communities to cope with disease, injury, and famine. Even preventive measures, such as hygiene practices or dietary regulations, reflected careful observation and accumulated knowledge. Art and symbolism were everywhere, encoding identity, history, and cosmology. Murals depicted creation myths, the movements of celestial bodies, and legendary heroes. Pottery designs recorded family lineage or seasonal cycles. Tattoos, body paint, and ornamentation communicated status, achievements, and spiritual devotion. Every artistic expression, whether functional or ceremonial, was embedded with meaning. Life was inseparable from the stories it told. Night returned the world to reflection and memory. Fires glowed in homes, drums faded from plazas, and stars stretched overhead, timeless and guiding. Families told stories, sang songs, and shared quiet moments. Even in darkness, the sense of connection, to ancestors, to community, to the land, remained strong. Life, in all its rigor and ritual, persisted, shaped by intention, belief, and care. To witness this world, even in imagination, is to appreciate not a primitive past but a sophisticated, interconnected civilization. It is a place of balance between labor and leisure, survival and beauty, tradition and innovation. Medieval America was not distant in spirit. It was vividly human, its heartbeat resonating through every act of work, play, and worship. As we move deeper into the rhythms of medieval America, it becomes increasingly clear how interconnected life, labor, and belief truly were. Every action carried layers of purpose, whether practical, spiritual, or social. Even the most ordinary task, grinding maize in a mortar, sweeping the floor of a home, or tending to animals, was imbued with meaning. Repetition and routine did not make life dull. Instead, they created structure, harmony, and connection. People understood that survival was not merely physical. It required attention to patterns, cycles, and the intricate web linking humans, nature, and the divine. Farming techniques grew increasingly sophisticated with experience. Terraces in highlands prevented soil erosion and conserved water, while in valleys, irrigation canals captured every drop of rainfall. Communities coordinated planting schedules, sometimes guided by celestial observation, ensuring that crops reached maturity in harmony with seasonal rains. They cultivated diverse varieties of maize, beans, squash, chili, and other plants, often using companion planting to enrich the soil and deter pests. Techniques like seed selection, crop rotation, and soil enrichment reveal a deep understanding of ecology, even without formal science. Every ear of maize harvested was the product of knowledge passed down across generations, a conversation between past and present. Domestic life mirrored this complexity. Kitchens and hearths were the center of activity, where food preparation combined practicality with ritual. Cooking fires were carefully tended, often kept alive across nights, ensuring warmth and readiness. Pottery vessels stored water, maize, or beans, and their designs often reflected cultural symbols or spiritual motifs. Children watched and learned, absorbing skills and social norms simultaneously. Tasks were rarely solitary. Women and men, young and old, participated together, reinforcing kinship and cooperation. Every meal carried layers of labor, artistry, and social meaning. The importance of clothing cannot be overstated. Beyond utility, garments express status, identity, and spirituality. Cotton textiles were spun, dyed, and woven with remarkable skill, while animal hides and feathers were integrated into garments for warmth, decoration, or symbolic power. A headdress adorned with quetzal feathers or jaguar motifs communicated not just wealth but alignment with sacred forces. Clothing bridged the mundane and the ceremonial, and people dressed not only for survival but for participation in a larger, cosmic order. Trade networks created unexpected connections across vast distances. Obsidian from volcanic regions traveled hundreds of miles to cities far away, while jade, shells, feathers, and textiles moved along river and mountain routes. Trade was not solely economic, it was cultural. Ideas, myths, rituals, and skills spread alongside physical goods. A piece of cloth might carry new weaving patterns, while a carved figure might introduce unfamiliar symbolic meaning. Communities, though geographically distant, shared knowledge and culture, demonstrating an early form of globalization driven by human ingenuity and mobility. Education, though informal, was rigorous. Apprenticeships ensured skill transmission in craft, agriculture, and medicine, while storytelling preserved history, law, and morality. Children learned observation and imitation, developing abilities through hands-on experience. Elders emphasized patience, discipline, and respect. Every act, from planting a seed to carving a tool, was both a practical lesson and a moral one. Society invested in its youth because each child represented continuity, the vessel through which memory, skill, and belief persisted. Music and dance maintained cohesion and transmitted cultural memory. Festivals celebrated agricultural cycles, victories, or celestial events, combining joy with instruction. Drums, flutes, rattles, and chants created soundscapes that guided movement, coordinated work, and marked ritual moments. Dances often reenacted myths, encoded history, or symbolized cosmic principles. Music was not decoration. It structured experience, anchored memory, and reinforced collective identity. From marketplaces to ceremonial plazas, sound created connection, shaping the rhythm of daily life. Health and medicine were integrated with observation of the natural world. Herbal knowledge was extensive. Leaves, bark, roots, and seeds were combined for healing. Ritual complemented medicine, addressing spiritual and emotional dimensions of illness. Preventive practices, such as hygiene, diet regulation, and seasonal adaptation, revealed careful attention to cause and effect. Healing required both skill and respect. Careless treatment was dangerous, thoughtful treatment reinforced trust, authority, and community stability. Religious and spiritual life permeated every moment. Temples, altars, and shrines were spaces where cosmic and human orders intersected. Priests interpreted omens, tracked celestial movements, and guided leaders, while households maintained smaller, intimate practices. Offerings, prayers, and rituals expressed gratitude, sought guidance, or averted misfortune. These practices were not abstract. They were deeply intertwined with the survival, prosperity, and cohesion of the community. Even in leisure, cultural meaning was present. Children played games that taught dexterity, strategy, and social interaction. Adults engaged in contests, storytelling, or crafts that reinforced skill and knowledge. Festivals blurred boundaries between work and celebration, teaching lessons while entertaining. Joy was never frivolous. It reinforced bonds, encouraged cooperation, and reminded individuals of the larger cycles they inhabited. Finally, the night sky served as a canvas for reflection, planning, and spiritual connection. Stars guided agricultural cycles, inspired stories, and anchored the imagination. Families gathered under the vast expanse, speaking to ancestors, observing celestial rhythms, or simply resting in communal warmth. Life in medieval America thrived in the space between labor, ritual, and reflection, a continuous interplay of survival, culture, and meaning. In every task, every gesture, every celebration, people existed in a world that demanded awareness, skill, and respect for forces larger than themselves. They were deeply human, creative, resilient, observant, and connected, crafting a civilization that continues to echo through the centuries, even in imagination. Delving further into the intricate tapestry of medieval America, it becomes impossible to separate everyday life from the broader rhythms of nature, community, and belief. Survival was never merely a private endeavor. It was an orchestrated effort connecting families, villages, and even distant cities. Each action, from tending a garden to preparing a feast, resonated far beyond the immediate moment, entwined with tradition, ritual, and social expectation. Communities understood that their well-being depended on constant attention to these threads, weaving them carefully to prevent collapse, imbalance, or misfortune. The landscape shaped not only what people could do, but how they thought. Mountains, rivers, forests, and deserts demanded solutions, inspiring innovation and adaptation. Agricultural terraces carved into steep slopes in the highlands were marvels of engineering, balancing water retention with erosion prevention. In lowland jungles, elevated platforms or stilted homes kept communities safe from flooding, insects, and disease. Across vast plains, mobile shelters and temporary encampments reflected a life attuned to seasonal movement and resource availability. People did not simply inhabit their environment. They negotiated with it, learning to anticipate its moods and respond creatively. Water management remained central to life and civilization. Canals, reservoirs, and aqueducts ensured that fields and communities thrived, even in the dry season. Systems required careful planning, collective maintenance, and deep understanding of natural behavior. Every stone placed, every channel dug, was an investment in community stability and survival. Water was treated with reverence and careful attention, not merely as a resource but as a living entity capable of both sustaining and punishing. The rhythm of rainfall dictated planting, festivals, and travel, a pattern that communities honored through observation, ritual, and shared experience. Food preparation combined practicality, culture, and spirituality. Maize, beans, and squash remained staples, but culinary practices were highly diverse and ingenious. Nixtamalization transformed maize into a more nutritious and versatile ingredient, while beans provided protein and balance. Squash, peppers, and tubers complemented meals with flavor, variety, and nutrition. Families prepared food communally, often accompanied by songs, chants, or prayers, connecting the act of eating to gratitude, rhythm, and social cohesion. Preservation techniques, such as drying, smoking, and fermenting, extended the life of essential resources, safeguarding communities through lean seasons. Clothing and textiles continued to reflect more than utility. They conveyed status, identity, and spiritual alignment. Cotton, wool, and animal hides were carefully prepared, dyed, and woven into garments that expressed creativity, belonging, and connection to the cosmos. Decoration carried symbolic significance. Feathers, shells, beads, and woven patterns communicated social role, achievements, or spiritual dedication. Garments became a language, read and understood by those who lived within these cultures. Dressing was an act of participation in a larger cultural and spiritual system, where even daily attire contributed to the maintenance of order and identity. Trade networks spread far beyond local boundaries, connecting distant regions through goods, ideas, and stories. Obsidian blades traveled hundreds of miles to serve both practical and ceremonial functions. Jade, textiles, feathers, and shells circulated widely, carrying cultural and spiritual significance alongside material value. Trade was as much about exchange of knowledge and custom as it was about goods. New agricultural techniques, weaving methods, and storytelling motifs moved along these routes, creating a web of connection that bound communities together across hundreds of miles. Education was experiential, integrated into everyday life. Apprentices learned trades under the guidance of skilled artisans, children observed parents in fields or workshops, and young healers studied under elders, absorbing knowledge of plants, rituals, and healing practices. Storytelling, song, and oral history ensured that morality, law, and memory were preserved alongside practical skill. Knowledge was cumulative, layered, and adaptable, transmitted through careful observation, repetition, and narrative rather than formalized schooling. Every moment was an opportunity for learning, every task a chance to internalize lessons of survival, craft, and ethics. Music and performance reinforced social bonds and cultural memory. Festivals and ceremonies combined rhythmic movement, chanting, and instrumental accompaniment to teach, celebrate, and communicate communal values. Dance movements often mimic nature, myth, or historical events, embedding complex stories in performance. Drums, flutes, rattles, and other instruments guided timing, coordinated collective action, and invoked spiritual presence. Music was inseparable from daily life, integrating work, ritual, and leisure into a cohesive pattern that united communities in sound, movement, and shared purpose. Health and healing intertwined observation, skill, and spiritual practice. Healers combined medicinal knowledge of hundreds of plants with ritual interventions designed to restore balance. Illness was understood as a disruption not only in the body but in social, spiritual, and environmental relationships. Treatments included massage, herbal preparations, purification rituals, and prayers. Preventive practices like diet regulation and hygiene measures reflected accumulated observation and an understanding of cause and effect. Communities relied on healers not only for recovery but for guidance on maintaining equilibrium and avoiding future harm. Even conflict was highly structured, reflecting a nuanced understanding of justice, honor, and social cohesion. Disputes were mediated by elders, with rules designed to prevent escalation. When combat occurred, it often followed codified patterns, ensuring fairness and minimizing unnecessary harm. Larger warfare, between cities or confederations, was framed within cosmological and religious understanding, with victories celebrated as both practical and spiritual achievements. Conflict was never casual. It carried weight, consequence, and meaning. Night brought reflection, storytelling, and rest. Fires glowed in homes, music faded from plazas, and stars stretched across the sky as anchors for thought and memory. Families spoke to ancestors, shared dreams, and reviewed the day's lessons. Even in darkness, life maintained rhythm, purpose, and connection. The threads of labor, ritual, education, and reflection wove together a resilient, adaptive, and deeply human civilization, demonstrating that medieval America was a world of intellect, creativity, and profound engagement with both the material and spiritual realms. As life in medieval America unfolded, the interweaving of environment, community, and culture became ever more apparent, revealing a civilization that thrived on careful observation, adaptation, and ingenuity. Survival demanded constant attention to the surrounding world. Every plant, animal, and stone could hold value, and every action carried implications for the balance of family, village, and wider networks. People learned to read the land as a text. River levels foretold seasonal change, the color of leaves indicated soil quality, animal behavior predicted weather. In such a world, knowledge was accumulated through lived experience, carefully transmitted from elder to youth. Agricultural practice remained the backbone of survival, yet it was never purely mechanical. Beyond planting and harvesting, people nurtured ecosystems. They rotated crops to prevent soil exhaustion, planted companion species to improve fertility, and incorporated fallen leaves, ash, or organic waste as natural fertilizer. Terraces in mountainous regions not only prevented erosion but created microclimates, allowing multiple crop cycles in a single year. Water management systems channeled streams into canals and reservoirs, providing consistent hydration for fields, and community-wide maintenance ensured these systems remained functional. Work was collective, teaching cooperation, responsibility, and the consequences of neglect. Beyond cultivation, foraging and hunting supplemented diets and strengthened bonds with nature. Hunters observed animal tracks, seasonal migrations, and feeding patterns to anticipate opportunities. Ritual often accompanied the act of taking life. Hunters offered thanks or small gifts to ensure spiritual balance and acknowledge the interdependence of all beings. Gathering wild plants required similarly careful attention. Roots, berries, herbs, and nuts were collected in sustainable quantities. Knowledge of growth cycles passed down through generations. Life required not only skill but ethical awareness, teaching respect for the natural world that supported human existence. Food preservation and preparation remained central. Techniques varied widely: drying, smoking, fermenting, or storing in underground pits prolonged shelf life, enabling communities to withstand periods of scarcity. Meals were a blend of nutrition, flavor, and ceremony. Cooking fires, often maintained continuously, became centers of domestic and communal life. Children learned by watching, imitating, and eventually participating in cooking, grinding, and baking. Meals were social events, spaces where knowledge, stories, and values were shared alongside sustenance. Clothing and adornment offered insights into identity, status, and belief. Fiber, cotton, and animal hides were meticulously prepared, dyed, and woven into functional and decorative garments. Beads, feathers, shells, and embroidered patterns encoded social rank, spiritual alignment, or achievements. Costumes for ceremonies were elaborate, communicating devotion, lineage, and skill. Even everyday attire was carefully constructed to meet environmental demands while symbolizing cultural values. Dressing was an act of participation in a larger social and spiritual ecosystem, bridging practicality and expression. Trade routes connected communities across vast distances, exchanging not only goods but ideas, techniques, and stories. Obsidian, jade, shells, and textiles circulated widely, carrying layered significance. A jade pendant might journey hundreds of miles, changing hands multiple times, acquiring stories and cultural meaning with each transfer. Trade facilitated cultural diffusion. Agricultural innovations, crafting methods, and oral traditions traveled alongside material goods, creating a web of influence that linked disparate societies. Communities, though geographically separated, shared knowledge, beliefs, and identity through this constant exchange. Music, performance, and ritual played integral roles in social cohesion. Drums, flutes, rattles, and song-guided agricultural work marked ceremonies and animated festivals. Dance often reenacted mythic stories, historic events, or natural processes, embedding complex knowledge in rhythm and movement. Festivals combined instruction with celebration, reinforcing communal bonds, transmitting values, and invoking spiritual presence. Music was not leisure alone. It structured experience, strengthened identity, and maintained cultural continuity. Education was experiential and holistic. Young people learned trades, agricultural techniques, and healing skills through observation and apprenticeship. Oral instruction transmitted history, ethics, and law, embedding lessons within narrative. Knowledge was cumulative, practical, and adaptive. Every household task carried potential for learning. Grinding maize taught patience and rhythm, weaving taught spatial reasoning, hunting taught observation and strategy. The integration of practical and moral education ensured children became capable, responsible members of society. Health and healing reflected sophisticated understanding of human and environmental interaction. Healers combined herbal remedies with spiritual rituals to address both physical and metaphysical causes of illness. Community wellness was reinforced through preventive practices, hygiene measures, dietary guidance, and seasonal adjustments. Healing emphasized balance of body, spirit, and environment, ensuring that treatment restored harmony as well as health. Conflict, while inevitable, was carefully regulated. Disputes were mediated by elders, and even organized warfare adhered to codified rules. protecting community cohesion and moral order. Victory and loss carried spiritual significance, reinforcing ethical codes and social obligations. Community members learned from conflicts, integrating lessons into collective knowledge, strengthening resilience for future challenges. Nighttime offered reflection, family bonding, and connection with the cosmos. Fires illuminated homes, stars guided thought, and stories of ancestors, heroes, and spirits echoed through the night. Life, in all its labor, ritual, learning, and celebration, remained deeply intertwined with nature, society, and belief systems. Medieval America was a civilization of profound human ingenuity, adaptability, and meaning, where every action carried weight, beauty, and purpose. As we continue to explore the daily lives of people in medieval America, it becomes increasingly evident that their world was a dynamic interplay of survival, culture, and community. Every choice, from the crops they planted to the designs they etched into pottery, reflected a deep understanding of both practical necessity and symbolic meaning. Life was organized around the cycles of the natural world: sunrise and sunset, seasonal rains, migrations of animals, flowering and harvesting of plants, and humans learned to move in harmony with these rhythms, building patterns of activity, work, and ritual that ensured stability and continuity. Hunting and gathering remained critical complements to agriculture. Hunters observed animal trails, listened to the wind and birds, and interpreted subtle environmental cues to track game. Hunting required patience, strategy, and intimate knowledge of terrain, weather, and animal behavior. Small game like rabbits and birds supplemented diets, while larger game such as deer, bison, or peccaries provided not only meat but hides for clothing and bones for tools. Gathering wild plants, nuts, and berries required equally careful observation, as maturity, season, and location determined nutritional value and safety. These activities were not merely about sustenance. They reinforced ecological knowledge, taught discipline, and connected humans to the land in profound ways. Food preparation reflected both ingenuity and ritual. Maize, beans, squash, and other staple crops were transformed into countless dishes, each requiring skill, timing, and attention. Grinding maize into flour was laborious, often done communally, with conversation, songs, or chants creating rhythm and cohesion. Boiling, roasting, fermenting, or drying enabled preservation and variety, turning raw ingredients into meals that sustained not only body but spirit. Communities shared meals during workdays and festivals alike, reinforcing social bonds, transmitting knowledge, and offering moments of joy amidst the relentless demands of daily life. Water management, as always, played a central role in survival and social organization. Canals, reservoirs, and aqueducts, carefully maintained and monitored, ensured that fields thrived and communities flourished even during dry seasons. Water was respected as a living force, essential for both agriculture and spiritual balance. Ceremonies often accompanied maintenance work, reinforcing the cultural understanding that human effort and natural forces were intertwined. Shared responsibility for water management strengthened community cohesion, teaching cooperation, foresight, and the consequences of neglect. Clothing and textiles were expressions of identity, social role, and spiritual connection. Fibers from cotton, animal hides, and plant sources were transformed into garments through spinning, weaving, and dyeing. Patterns and decorations conveyed lineage, accomplishments, and devotion to deities or spirits. Ritual attire, such as ceremonial headdresses adorned with feathers and beads, indicated both personal and communal significance. Even ordinary garments carried meaning, marking individuals as members of a larger cultural and social system. Dressing was an act of participation in this intricate tapestry of human expression, blending function, beauty, and symbolism. Trade networks connected far-flung regions, moving not only goods but ideas, techniques, and stories. Obsidian, jade, shells, textiles, and feathers traveled hundreds of miles, often passing through multiple communities. Trade introduced innovations in agriculture, craft, and ritual, spreading knowledge and influencing local practices. markets became vibrant centers of exchange, where social interaction, information sharing, and economic activity coexisted. The movement of goods and ideas fostered a sense of interconnectedness, binding distant societies through shared knowledge, resources, and cultural values. Music and dance remained integral to daily life, reinforcing social cohesion and transmitting cultural memory. Drumming, flute playing, and vocal chanting accompanied agricultural work, ceremonies, and festivals. Dance movements often reenacted mythic events, seasonal cycles, or natural phenomena, encoding complex information in embodied form. Festivals combined instruction, entertainment, and spiritual engagement, creating occasions for communal reinforcement of values, collective celebration, and ritual observance. Music and movement were inseparable from the rhythm of life, guiding experience, structuring social interaction, and maintaining cultural continuity. Education, although informal, was rigorous and multifaceted. Children learned by observing, imitating, and participating in daily tasks, apprenticeships, and rituals. Skills, ethics, and social norms were transmitted simultaneously, ensuring that knowledge was both practical and culturally grounded. Elders played central roles, mentoring the young in agricultural techniques, craft production, medicinal practices, and spiritual understanding. Storytelling and oral history provided moral guidance, historical context, and reinforcement of societal norms, ensuring that lessons of the past informed the present and future. Health and medicine reflected careful observation and sophisticated understanding. Healers combined herbal remedies with ritual interventions to treat illness, restore balance, and prevent recurrence. Knowledge of medicinal plants, dietary regulation, and hygiene practices was extensive and closely tied to spiritual beliefs. Healing was holistic, addressing body, mind, and environment simultaneously, reinforcing community resilience and trust. Preventive practices emphasized understanding natural cycles, adjusting behavior to minimize illness, and maintaining social and spiritual harmony. Conflict, when it arose, was carefully regulated. Disputes over land, water, or honor were often mediated by elders or community councils, seeking resolution without escalation. Organized warfare adhered to rules and rituals, ensuring that violence served broader social, political, or spiritual purposes rather than chaos. Victory and defeat carried moral and spiritual implications, teaching lessons and reinforcing communal values. Even in conflict, society prioritized structure, accountability, and long-term cohesion over immediate gain or destruction. Night brought quiet reflection, storytelling, and familial connection. Fires glowed in homes, illuminating faces as stories of ancestors, heroes, and spirits were recounted. Stars stretched across the sky, serving as guides for thought, navigation, and reflection. Life in medieval America thrived at the intersection of work, ritual, learning, and celebration. Every action carried weight and meaning, and the integration of environment, society, and spirituality created a civilization that was deeply adaptive, resilient, and profoundly human. As the tapestry of medieval American life continues to unfold, one cannot help but notice how intricately daily existence was woven with observation, creativity, and communal purpose. Agricultural practices were among the most visible expressions of this balance between survival and sophistication. Farmers cultivated terraces in highlands to prevent erosion while optimizing sunlight exposure and water retention. In floodplains or lowlands, fields were organized to make use of natural irrigation, supplemented by canals and reservoirs carefully maintained by the community. Multiple crop cycles were planned around rainfall, sunlight, and celestial observation, creating a rhythm that harmonized human activity with natural cycles. Maize, beans, and squash, the classic three sisters, were grown together in complementary patterns, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of plant compatibility and soil enrichment. Crop diversity ensured nutritional balance and mitigated risk, while communal labor in planting, weeding, and harvesting reinforced social cohesion. Beyond farming, hunting and foraging played vital roles in supplementing diets, teaching observation, and sustaining cultural traditions. Hunters read animal tracks, listened to subtle sounds, and predicted movements based on seasonal changes. Rituals often accompanied hunting, acknowledging the life taken and seeking favor from spiritual forces. Gathering wild plants, nuts, and fruits demanded precise knowledge of growth patterns, seasonal timing, and edible versus poisonous species. These activities were not merely survival strategies. They nurtured ecological literacy, patience, and an intimate relationship with the land. Food preparation and preservation were sophisticated and highly organized. Nixtamalization transformed maize into more nutritious flour, while beans provided essential protein, and squash added flavor, variety, and sustenance. Drying, smoking, fermenting, and pit storage allowed communities to withstand periods of scarcity, ensuring survival through unpredictable seasons. Cooking fires were central to domestic and communal life, maintained continuously for warmth, readiness, and shared social engagement. Children participated from a young age, learning both practical skills and social norms through observation, imitation, and guided practice. Meals were spaces of community reinforcement, education, and celebration, linking nutrition to ritual and social cohesion. Clothing and adornment reflected identity, status, and spiritual alignment. Fibers from cotton, wool, and plant materials were woven into garments of remarkable quality, often dyed and decorated with symbolic patterns. Feathers, shells, beads, and embroidery indicated lineage, achievements, and devotion. Ceremonial attire, such as headdresses or cloaks, communicated spiritual significance and social hierarchy. Even everyday clothing functioned as a statement of participation in cultural life, blending practicality with artistry and meaning. Dressing was not simply a private act. It was an expression of connection to society, ancestry, and the spiritual cosmos. Trade networks enabled cultural exchange across vast distances. Obsidian, jade, shells, textiles, and exotic feathers traveled hundreds of miles, facilitating not only economic exchange but also the diffusion of knowledge, techniques, and symbolic motifs. Markets became hubs of interaction, where communities learned from one another, shared innovations, and reinforced social ties. The movement of goods was inseparable from the movement of ideas. Weaving patterns, pottery techniques, agricultural knowledge, and ceremonial practices traveled alongside commodities, creating a web of cultural interconnectedness. Music, dance, and ritual continued to structure daily and ceremonial life. Drums, flutes, rattles, and song guided agricultural work, celebrations, and rites of passage. Dance often reenacted mythic narratives, seasonal changes, or historical events, encoding complex knowledge in movement. Festivals blended instruction, entertainment, and spiritual observance, reinforcing values, collective memory, and communal identity. Music and rhythm were not mere embellishments. They guided labor, connected people socially and spiritually, and ensured continuity of cultural practices. Education was experiential, immersive, and holistic. Apprenticeships and hands-on learning transmitted practical skills, ethical frameworks, and social norms. Oral storytelling reinforced history, morality, and law, ensuring that cultural knowledge persisted even without formal records. Every activity, from crafting tools to preparing food, offered lessons in patience, precision, and responsibility. Knowledge was cumulative, adaptive, and socially reinforced, with elders guiding and mentoring youth to ensure continuity and capability. Health and medicine demonstrated keen observation and careful integration of practice and belief. Healers combined herbal remedies with ritual practices to address both physical and spiritual aspects of illness. Preventive measures, such as hygiene, seasonal adjustments, and diet management, reflected long-standing empirical knowledge. Healing emphasized balance between body, mind, spirit, and environment, reinforcing trust and resilience within communities. Conflict, though inevitable, was structured and meaningful. Disputes over land, water, or honor were mediated by elders, and organized warfare followed codified rules to preserve social stability. Victories and defeats carried moral and spiritual significance, teaching lessons and reinforcing community values. Even in tension, society prioritized order, accountability, and the long-term maintenance of cohesion over impulsive violence. Nightfall brought reflection, family bonding, and quiet observation of the cosmos. Fires illuminated homes as stories of ancestors, heroes, and spirits were recounted. Stars guided navigation, agricultural timing, and spiritual thought. Life in medieval America thrived at the intersection of labor, ritual, learning, and celebration. Every gesture carried meaning. Every day was both survival and expression. Communities existed in deep harmony with the world around them, demonstrating resilience, creativity, and profound humanity. As the rhythms of medieval American life unfold, one begins to appreciate the extraordinary ways in which humans harmonized with nature, society, and the cosmos. Daily existence was a blend of labor, ritual, learning, and reflection, a constant negotiation between survival and cultural expression. Even the smallest tasks, preparing a meal, tending animals, weaving textiles, carried layers of meaning, connecting individuals to community, ancestors, and the spiritual world. Life was rarely solitary. Every action was embedded within a web of relationships, responsibilities, and observation, requiring mindfulness, skill, and care. Agriculture continued to dominate subsistence, yet its practice was sophisticated and contextually adapted. Farmers observed the cycles of the moon, rainfall, and temperature, planning, planting, and harvesting to optimize yield. Crop rotation and companion planting enriched the soil while reducing pests. Maize, beans, and squash, grown together, provided balanced nutrition and enhanced soil fertility. Fields were not only sources of sustenance but also spaces of learning and ritual, where children watched elders, learning the rhythms of planting, the subtle timing of irrigation, and the signs that predicted crop success or failure. These lessons went beyond practicality. They taught patience, observation, and respect for the land. Hunting and foraging complemented agriculture, contributing both nutrition and ecological knowledge. Hunters tracked game with skill, interpreting tracks, droppings, and seasonal behaviors to anticipate movement. Rituals often accompanied hunting, expressing gratitude for the life taken and acknowledging the interdependence of all beings. Gathering wild plants, nuts, and fruits demanded similar attention, as misidentifying species could result in illness. These activities taught observation, discipline, and a deep, practical understanding of the environment, reinforcing the spiritual and social lessons woven into everyday life. When we look deeper into the rhythm of medieval American life, it feels as though we are stepping into a world where every sound, every color, every step was woven into the larger story of existence, and nothing happened in isolation. Imagine the first light of dawn stretching over fields of maize and beans, the dew still clinging to leaves while smoke rose gently from hearths that had never fully gone out through the night, because the fire was not simply warmth or cooking, it was protection, spirit, and continuity. Families stirred slowly, the older children already accustomed to the tasks that awaited them, the younger ones rubbing their eyes and listening to the morning sounds. The grinding of maize on stone, the soft rhythm of hands weaving fibers, the low voices of elders sharing instructions for the day. It was not the hurried rush that we know in modern mornings. It was a measured unfolding, an alignment with the sun, with the land, with each other. The fields themselves were more than farmland. They were spaces of memory and connection. Each planting season carried echoes of previous generations, each row tended by hands that remembered the mistakes and successes of ancestors. The three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, stood together not just as crops but as a symbol of cooperation, each plant aiding the others, each one offering something the other lacked. While adults bent over their work, children learned by watching, sometimes playing at the edge of the fields, imitating the motions of planting, repeating the words they heard from their parents. And when the midday sun pressed down, people paused, ate together, and shared not only food but conversation, laughter, and planning. Because work was never only work, it was also teaching and bonding. Hunting parties sometimes departed at first light, slipping quietly through forests, following tracks, observing the movement of birds that betrayed the passage of animals. There was ritual in this too, for hunting was both practical and spiritual, a dialogue between human and animal. When a deer or bison was taken, it was done with respect, offerings were spoken, and gratitude expressed, because food was not simply taken. It was given, and acknowledging that balance was essential for the harmony of the world. Back in the villages, women and children prepared hides, bones, and meat. Nothing wasted. Each piece transformed into tools, garments, or sustenance, while songs accompanied the rhythm of work, turning necessity into something communal and almost ceremonial. And in the evenings, when the day's tasks slowed and fires flickered more brightly against the deepening sky, stories flowed like water. Elders sat with the young, recounting the myths of creation, the journeys of heroes, the lessons hidden within triumphs and mistakes of the past. These were not tales to pass idle time. They were the vessels of history, the framework of values, the invisible threads binding community and memory together. Imagine sitting there, the fire crackling, stars shining overhead, while the voice of a storyteller painted worlds that felt as real as the one beneath your feet, worlds where spirits shaped rivers, where ancestors transformed into animals, where courage and humility decided the fate of entire villages. Children leaned in, eyes wide, and even adults listened intently, because within those stories were the answers to tomorrow's questions. Festivals broke the rhythm of ordinary life and turned villages into centers of color, music, and movement. Drums echoed into the night, flutes carried haunting notes into the air, and bodies moved in unison, dancing out myths, victories, and prayers. Feathers gleamed in firelight, painted faces shone with meaning, and the beat of feet against the earth became both celebration and communication with the spirits. These festivals were not distractions. They were essential, the moments where community renewed itself, where people remembered that life was not just toil but joy, not just survival but meaning. Trade goods arrived, songs from distant lands were sung, stories from travelers mingled with local memory, and suddenly the village was not isolated but part of a great web stretching across valleys, rivers, mountains, and coasts. Night in these societies held its own magic. The sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars so bright that patterns could be traced easily, and people read the heavens as if they were a great book. Stars guided planting, hunting, and travel, but they also guided thought, sparking questions about creation, destiny, and balance. Families lay together, pointing upward, sharing what each constellation meant, how it connected to ancestors, how it explained the cycles of life and death. In those quiet moments, the line between science and myth blurred, because both were paths to understanding. And as sleep came, it did not feel like an end but a continuation, a merging of day into dream, dream into memory, and memory into tomorrow. Daily life in medieval America flowed like this, never in separate compartments, always connected. The planting bound to the hunting, the cooking tied to the stories, the songs echoing through labor and ritual alike, the trade routes carrying not just goods but ideas, and the stars above watching silently, reminding everyone of their place in a vast and breathing world. Life was hard, yes, but it was also rich, layered, and deeply human, and in every gesture, whether it was grinding maize, carving a tool, weaving a garment, or offering words of gratitude to the spirits, there was an acknowledgement that nothing existed alone, that everything was part of the great river of existence. As the seasons turned, the rhythm of medieval American life changed too, and each shift carried with it not only new tasks but also new emotions, because survival was inseparable from the cycles of nature. When the rains came, the fields softened, the smell of damp earth filled the air, and people walked barefoot through the mud, planting with both hands and hearts, knowing that every seed pushed into the soil was a promise for the months to come. During dry seasons, water had to be guarded, carried, channeled, shared, and sometimes fought for. Yet even then there was a sense that water was sacred, something more than a resource, something that tied every family and every breath together. Children grew up learning the songs that called for rain, the prayers whispered at dawn, and the techniques that kept crops alive when skies withheld their generosity. Life in the villages was rarely silent. The crack of maize cobs being split, the grinding rhythm of stones turning kernels into flour, the laughter of children chasing each other through courtyards, the calls of traders arriving from distant settlements with baskets of salt, obsidian, or brightly colored feathers. It was all sound woven into one great fabric. In the middle of it all, elders might sit in shaded corners, weaving baskets or shaping pottery, speaking in low tones about what the future might bring, their eyes not only on the present but also on the continuity of the generations. Pottery, decorated with swirling designs, carried water and food, but also told stories in its patterns, symbols that echoed rivers, animals, or stars, as though each vessel was not only useful but also alive with memory. Travel itself was part of daily existence. Roads and footpaths stretched across valleys and forests, connecting one community with another, and though journeys could be long and dangerous, they were also opportunities for learning and exchange. A traveler might arrive carrying turquoise beads or cacao beans, but what mattered just as much were the songs and stories he carried. News of distant ceremonies, tales of conflicts, marriages, or floods. Villages would pause to listen, because every piece of information from afar reminded them that they were part of something larger, that they were threads in a vast and intricate tapestry. And when the sun fell, the world transformed once again. Fires lit up not just homes but entire plazas, flames flickering across painted walls and faces, and the night became a place of reflection. Families gathered to share food, to rest, to listen, while the village sometimes pulsed with drums that could be heard far beyond its boundaries. A circle would form, dancers painted and adorned in feathers stepping in time with the beat, shadows stretching across the ground. And in those moments, people believed they were not only honoring the spirits but also stepping into their presence. Time itself seemed to bend during these ceremonies, because the movements repeated those of ancestors, the chants echoed words spoken for centuries, and the fire, though fresh, was linked to flames that had burned in ages past. Children often fell asleep to these sounds, their dreams filled with images of animals, warriors, stars, and rivers, while their parents carried them back to their homes when the night grew deep. Sleep did not separate them from life but extended it, because dreams were often seen as messages, as guidance, and the next morning elders might ask what visions were seen in sleep, interpreting them as signs for planting, travel, or caution. In this way, even the private realm of dreams was connected to the wider flow of the community. The craft of weaving tells us more than words can. Hours upon hours were spent turning cotton or wool into threads, dyeing them with plants, minerals, or insects, and weaving them into garments whose colors glowed like the land itself. Deep blues of rivers, reds of earth, yellows of maize, greens of forests. Each pattern had meaning, each knot told a story, and when a person wore such a garment, they carried not just warmth or protection but the identity of their people, the memory of ancestors, and the mark of the weaver who created it. Feathers, beads, and shells were added with care, transforming clothing into living symbols of belonging and pride. Rituals filled the calendar, some simple and quiet, others grand and loud. A child reaching a certain age might be marked with a small ceremony, given words of guidance and perhaps a carved object to carry as protection. A marriage was celebrated with music, food, and gifts, families uniting and affirming bonds that stretched far into the future. Death was met not with silence but with careful rites, offerings placed beside the body, prayers spoken to guide the soul to the realm of ancestors, and songs sung to remind the living that loss was also continuity. Nothing in life happened without ritual because every step, from birth to death, was part of the journey of both individual and community, inseparable from the land and the spirits. And as one day flowed into the next, people felt themselves not as isolated individuals but as part of a current, a stream that began long before their birth and would continue long after. The maize in the field was linked to the stories told by firelight. The stars above were linked to the paths trodden by feet in the dust. The songs were linked to the labor of hands shaping stone, clay, or cloth. To live in medieval America was to live in constant awareness of connection, of cycles, of meaning, and even in hardship, even in hunger, there was always a sense that life was part of something vast and enduring. Imagine the morning not as a sudden beginning but as a slow unfurling of life that had never truly stopped during the night. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, carrying with it the scent of maize and herbs, while the first rays of sun illuminated painted walls and carved wooden beams that bore the marks of countless hands over generations. The village stirred not all at once but in ripples, first the older children carrying water jars, then the women preparing the first meal of the day, and finally the men gathering tools, bows, or nets for the tasks ahead. Yet there was no strict separation of roles as we might imagine. Life demanded flexibility, and a skilled hand was always welcome, whether it came from a woman weaving or a man grinding maize beside her. Balance was not only in crops but in people, and survival depended on it. Imagine the morning not as a sudden beginning but as a slow unfurling of life that had never truly stopped during the night. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, carrying with it the scent of maize and herbs, while the first rays of sun illuminated painted walls and carved wooden beams that bore the marks of countless hands over generations. The village stirred not all at once but in ripples, first the older children carrying water jars, then the women preparing the first meal of the day, and finally the men gathering tools, bows, or nets for the tasks ahead. Yet there was no strict separation of roles as we might imagine. Life demanded flexibility, and a skilled hand was always welcome, whether it came from a woman weaving or a man grinding maize beside her. Balance was not only in crops but in people, and survival depended on it. Travelers sometimes arrived at dawn, their silhouettes cutting across the horizon, carrying baskets suspended on their backs or balanced with wooden frames across their shoulders. They brought not only goods but also impressions of lands that sounded almost mythical to those who remained rooted to their own soil. One might speak of mountains where the air grew so thin that even fire burned differently, another of rivers so wide it seemed they had no opposite bank, and still another of coastal waters where salt crystallized under the sun and fish leapt in numbers that dazzled the eyes. These descriptions lingered in the imagination of children, who repeated them in their games, pretending to cross vast deserts or climb invisible peaks while their parents listened carefully, measuring what such journeys meant for trade, alliance, or caution. At midday, the village often shifted its pace, the heat pressing down and urging people toward shade. It was during these hours that artisans became most visible, sitting with tools of bone, stone, or wood, carving intricate patterns into everyday objects. A bowl might hold stew, but its edges could be alive with images of birds and serpents. A tool might cut maize, but its handle bore patterns that told the lineage of the family that owned it. Craft was not a separate sphere from life. It was life made visible in form, line, and color. Paints ground from minerals and plants turned walls into canvases, their bright reds and deep blacks holding both decoration and messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes prayers. Children were never idle observers. While their elders worked, they practiced with miniature tools, tried their hands at weaving small bands of fiber, or followed hunters on short trips to learn how to read tracks in the earth. A bent twig, a faint print in the mud, the sudden flight of birds. All of these were lessons written on the land, and children learned to read them as fluently as letters in a book. Failure was expected, laughter accompanied mistakes, but knowledge passed gradually, until one day a child could stand with confidence, holding bough or basket, ready to carry the weight of adulthood. The evening brought yet another shift, because life was not a straight line from work to rest but a cycle of transformations. Fires flared, their light revealing masks that had been resting through the day, waiting for the moment when the dance would begin. These masks were not costumes in our sense of the word. They were presences, embodiments of forces and ancestors. When a dancer lowered one over his face, he ceased to be himself for that moment, moving as the jaguar, the eagle, or the spirit of rain. The community responded not as an audience but as participants in a dialogue, clapping, chanting, stepping in rhythm, so that the line between human and divine blurred in the flicker of flame. Food always tied the day together. A pot of stew might include maize thickened with beans, squash flavored with herbs, or the meat from a successful hunt, simmered with peppers that gave both heat and depth. Meals were shared, not hoarded, because the act of eating together reaffirmed the bonds of kinship and obligation. Guests and travelers were welcomed, their bowls filled alongside the villagers, because hospitality was not simply kindness but necessity. One never knew when one might be the traveler in need. During harvest, feasts expanded into celebrations, and food became abundant, almost ceremonial, piled high on woven mats while music and laughter echoed late into the night. Yet beneath the joy there was always an awareness of fragility. Crops could fail, storms could rise, conflict could break out along trade routes. This tension infused life with urgency, making every act of preparation, every offering to the spirits, every shared story matter all the more. Elders reminded the young that nothing was permanent, that balance required care, that respect for the land and for each other was not optional but the very foundation of survival. These teachings did not come in stern lectures but in stories, in metaphors, in examples lived day after day, so that wisdom seeped into the mind almost unnoticed, until one day it became instinct. Night deepened, and stars burned so bright that the sky itself seemed alive. Families lay together, pointing upward, whispering the names of constellations, tracing with their fingers the paths ancestors had once walked across the heavens. The Milky Way was not just a band of light. It was a river of souls, a reminder that life and death flowed into one another. The hush of the night, broken only by the chirp of insects or the distant call of an owl, wrapped the village in stillness, and within that stillness, people felt both small and infinite, anchored to their fires and homes yet connected to a universe without end. And so the cycle repeated, not in monotonous sameness but in ever-deepening layers, each day adding texture to the one before, each story reinforcing the weave of community, each ritual reminding people that their lives, though fleeting, were part of a continuum that stretched backward into forgotten centuries and forward into unwritten ones. Medieval America was not static, not silent, not empty. It was alive, breathing, pulsing with the energy of countless lives intertwined like threads in a vast and unending fabric.